Hey, thanks so much for checking out this episode of Better Student Ministry. My name's Mark and this is Jared, and together we have over 30 years of youth ministry experience. We hope that you find this episode useful. If so, make sure that you click the subscribe and like button so that you get notifications when new episodes come out. And please, if you found this useful, share it with as many people as possible.
On today's topic, there may be some sensitive things that we discuss. And before we get into it, we want you to know a couple things. Number one, we're not professionals. We're not counselors. We're just youth ministry guys who love students and want to help you. Number two, some of the thoughts we're going to share today aren't even necessarily our thoughts, but they're things that we've read and we've learned, and we're going to recommend some of those resources to you. And lastly, we want to make sure in this conversation that we always keep in mind the most important thing when working with students and having hard, difficult conversations is we have to have deep, loving, committed relationship with them. All of youth ministry is about adults loving students and committing to helping them navigate through life. So we hope this is a blessing to you guys. Check it out. All right, hey everybody, welcome back to Better Student Ministry Podcast. Mark, how's it going?
It's going very well. I'm excited to be back again.
Yes, back at it. Feels good.
Yes.
In their new studio. If you didn't know, if you missed the last episode, we have built out a brand new podcasting studio. So if you enjoyed listening to us and want to watch us, you can find us on YouTube and watch the whole podcast there.
Yeah, our hope is that this will be useful to youth leaders, volunteer youth leaders, full-time youth leaders, and that will provide some opportunities to create some good conversations amongst leaders and amongst teams. And so we love doing this Better Student Ministry stuff.
Yeah, we're excited. Last podcast we talked about sexuality in a general sense, how to talk to teenagers about sexuality
And identity.
Yeah. Today we're going to go a little bit deeper into that and a little more specific in the issue of gender identity and what's happened with the kind of the transgender movement and what's taking place in our culture. And so we want to dive into that because it's a specific kind of subcategory, but a massive subcategory because there's not anybody that's in youth ministry that is not dealing with this reality right now in our culture.
Right. Yeah, and I think our desire in having this conversation is we believe that the more information we have, the more knowledge we have, the better it is for us to apply wisdom, right? So our hope is that this conversation will be one that gives you some mental resources that you can apply when you're pacing with students, when you're pacing with families, teenagers, and even in general, just navigating the culture that our students are in. Because the reality is, even if you don't have students in your youth ministry, that this may be a struggle for them or an issue for them, they know people who do. And so they might not be physically in your space, but you're pacing with students who every day are passing in the halls and friendships of and all sorts of things. So the more information, I'm just a firm believer of the more, if we want to exercise knowledge well, it has to be with wisdom. And so the starting line is this knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. So today will be a little bit different. This is a topic that I was asked to speak about a year ago. And to be honest with you, I felt very underprepared and resourced for it. And so in preparation for that talk, I did a lot of research and spent a lot of time reading, a lot of time listening to podcasts. And my whole understanding of this issue was really dramatically changed in a way that I felt like was super helpful for me to understand what is actually happening and what is going on. Yeah. And so today we're going to do a little different where it's going to be kind of more of an interview style because I've spent a lot of time looking at some of this stuff, researching this stuff. Now, here's what I want you to know. Like, I am not an expert.
Yeah.
I'm not a therapist, psychologist, gender expert at all. I'm just sharing with you what I have read from those who have done the work and done research. You could disagree with it. You could throw it out. I would encourage you to read the books that I recommend, read the stuff, listen to the people that I listen to. And but at the end of the day, I felt it very helpful for me to understand what is taking place with our teenagers. And I think that's the starting point is this. If we don't know what the problem is, it's hard to know how to help.
Yeah. Yeah, and that, that's the case, just to use a military metaphor that I use all the time, like part of our job is to triage a situation, right? We might not be the final medical professional or that saves the life, but our job as accountable, healthy adult leaders in ministry is to help identify, okay, what is the problem? Where's the bleeding coming from? And what's the source of it, so that then we can find the proper course of action. And whether it's, in this situation, whether it's counseling, whether it's just having somebody that's safe that you can talk to and get my thoughts out of my head and all those sorts of things.
Right.
So Jared, in getting us started here, let's take a quick look at how we've gotten to the place that we are right now, right? Because it seems as though this is a bigger issue than it's ever been. And I'm even thinking back in my years of youth ministry, full-time youth ministry, which now is, over 5 years ago. But then when we started almost over 20 years ago since we started youth ministry, and this was not something that I had to deal with on a regular basis. And as I was transitioning out, I was very aware this is becoming a more and more common thing that teenagers are dealing with and interacting with, and whether it's their own personal struggle or whether it's their friends of theirs. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of how have we gotten to where we are right now, and what exactly, how does establishing the truth of where we're at right now help us in pacing with and moving forward with teenagers?
Yeah. So if you think about the issue of gender dysphoria, and by the way, I'll say this off the bat. There's a woman named Abigail Schreier who's an author. She's not a Christian. She wrote a book called Irreversible Damage. And I believe she's a journalist who started to see this issue and was really curious, and so did a ton of research. And she wrote a great book called Irreversible Damage. I'd encourage you to read it. A lot of what I've learned came from her and some other sources. So in her book, what she lays out is this. She says, for the last 100 years, set aside maybe this last 20 years or something, there's what's called like classic gender dysphoria, right? You could diagnose it in the DSM-5. We had actually had a pretty good track record of understanding what it is, who it affects, and even how to treat it effectively. And it was considered a dysphoria. So meaning this, people struggle with it. And what they found was, over the last 100 years, in fact, his name is Dr. Kenneth Zucker. He's like the premier doctor in treating this and the expert in this area. And what they found was predominantly it always happened with young boys. So gender dysphoria of the last 100 years was almost predominantly an issue with young boys. And in what they would do to treat it was their classical approach was kind of this idea of using counseling and therapy and looking at kind of other issues that were contributing to this dysphoria about their gender, young boys feeling like they were actually girls in the wrong bodies. And what's interesting is Kenneth Zucker saw an 88% of the young boys who originally came into his practice, by the time that they got through puberty with treatment, 88% of them no longer struggle with the issue of gender dysphoria. So essentially, like, the biology and the therapy helped them work through that issue, and as they became men, it no longer was an issue for them, for the majority of them, 88%.
Yeah.
Now, so that was the kind of the typical approach, which is this. Okay, this gender dysphoria is a real thing. It's presenting predominantly in young boys. The approach to treat this, though, is to say to them, this is not the norm. We're not going to celebrate this. We're going to help you work through this with the understanding that for most of you, as you go through puberty and get the treatment, you're going to come out of it no longer struggling with this issue.
Let me pause for just a second here and indulge a side rabbit trail question here. So it appears as though, at least from this doctor and maybe even the research that you read, that this is something that in theory is not right and needs to be corrected.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to use right or wrong, or you could use the word normal, abnormal. I mean, there's a bunch of different. So we're not trying to place value on those words as far as the person who has value, but we are trying to place functionality on those words. So like, okay, this is not the normal or average or maybe most healthy or beneficial way for someone to operate. So you're saying there's a dysfunction or a dysphoria that's happening in the brain, between the brain and the physical body, where they're feeling like they're not in the right body that they should be.
And it may be, I mean, it may be obvious if people are checking in on this channel and listening to it, that we have a certain standard by which we kind of live our lives. In Better Student Ministry, the implication is we live our lives through the plan and purpose of the gospel, right? And so in having this conversation, there is this awareness that God has kind of a specific design for humanity, and we talk a lot about that in our previous podcast for those to listen to on sexuality and identity. And so there is this awareness that there is something that is not what God's perfect plan is for our lives, and we recognize that sin is a part of that, that has corrupted the reality that we live in. And so as leaders coming alongside students and families, we want to help point them towards what God's perfect plan is for their lives. And so if this is a dysfunction or an inaccurate working out of our hearts or our minds or combination of those things, there are some things and ways in which we can present the gospel to people that help them see who God sees them as and help them understand and sort through some of this. So.
Yeah, and I think we all, listen, the way to think about it is this. Many, many, many people struggle with issues, mental health issues. So if I struggle with depression or I struggle with anxiety or I struggle with schizophrenia, right? What this is saying is over the last 100 years, we would not look at those things and say, yeah, those are good. That's a healthy way to operate. Right?
Yeah.
Depression, anxiety, whatever the mental health issue is. Gender dysphoria was treated in the same way.
Yeah.
It was said, this is a real thing. We're not denying this is a real thing that people struggle with. But what we're saying is this is not the healthiest way for you to live. The healthiest way for you to live is to have your mind and the perception of your gender be aligned with your actual biological gender.
Sure. Now, our culture right now, though, would probably say that that's not true, right? Like they would say how you feel is how you're supposed to be, which is where all of this kind of collides in our lives right now. So for some, this may be the idea even that we would refer to this as some sort of disorder or a mental deficit of some sort is potentially offensive to some people.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, what I'm doing is laying out to you historically, here's how this issue's been perceived.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just kind of setting the table for the rest of the conversation.
So you could call that classic gender dysphoria, which has been up until 20 years ago or so. That's been the way it's been perceived. That's the way it's been treated. And 88% success rate has been very relative. Like that's very high.
Yeah.
What has happened recently in the last 20 years is you could classify it as like a recent onset gender dysphoria.
Yeah.
And what Abigail Schreier argues in her book, and I think it's really something that we really need to consider, is what's happening now is not the same as what's been happening over 100 years.
Yeah.
That there's different. This is not classic gender dysphoria in the way that we've known it for the long time that we've been studying it.
Yeah.
This issue that is happening now and emerging in our culture is really different. And I've got some things that she lays out and others as to why it's different than what historical kind of classic gender dysphoria has been.
Sure. And so this information will help us understand something dramatic has changed in the last few years that we need to be aware of.
So the kind of the idea that was portrayed in culture is, well, the reason why there's so many more transgender young people is because it's just accepted and celebrated more.
Right. So they can feel more free to be honest about.
So they were always there.
Yeah.
But now they can kind of come forward.
But you're suggesting that the statistics is not proving that.
The problem is the stats don't actually line up with that being true. Okay, and so here's one. The biggest issue is what we're seeing now is the overwhelming massive increase in those identifying as transgender are not with young boys, as what's been historical, but they're actually with teenage girls. So preteen to teenage girls are overwhelmingly the massive amount of new young people who are identifying as transgender. And the other interesting piece about that, which kind of flies in the face of the idea that, well, people are just identifying it now because it's a safe space, is the vast majority of people that are coming out as transgender are not what you would think if that were true, which would be people in their 30s and 40s, right? Who I've been this my whole life.
Right.
It's never been safe. Now it's finally safe and I can come out. We're not seeing that. We're
Yeah,
not seeing people in their 40s come out in droves. What we're seeing is preteens and teenage and almost exclusively young women,
Yeah.
which again is totally different than what we've known and seen.
And not even really young women, young girls.
Young girls, yeah. Preteen to teen.
Yeah.
So, for example, here's some statistics. In Britain, they've seen a 4,000% increase in the last decade of girls seeking medical help for transgenderism. So, again, even if it was true where now it's a safe space, the level of increase seems out of line with that narrative.
Yeah.
In 2016 to 2017, the number of females requesting surgery quadrupled. 17 young girls who identify as transgender, they're 70 times more likely to do so with a friend group. So this also flies in the face of what we've typically known as about transgenderism, which is it was always an individual issue. So young boys who would have it it had nothing to do with a friend group or other peers. It was an individual issue that they struggled with, that they felt with. Oftentimes, they had told hardly anybody.
Yeah.
Where now what we're seeing is there's the young girls who come out as transgender are 70 times more likely to do so in some sort of a friend group coming out together.
Yeah.
So there's this social aspect to the transgender movement that has never existed in history before and makes it something completely different.
Yeah, I don't know if we're planning on getting to this a little bit later, but is there an explanation for that, or is it just an observation?
Yeah, so we'll get to some of the potential explanations for that.
Yeah.
One of the other statistics that would kind of fly in the face of the narrative that people are coming out more because it's accepted, and this is a good thing, is that actually suicide rates are going up, not down.
Yeah.
So if the
thought would be if people are being freed and they're finally allowing themselves to be their authentic self, there should be more personal self-esteem in it, right? But what we're seeing is it's still
the opposite.
Yeah, and now they may say, well, the culture has still not fully accepted it, or it's is like damage that has still been with them for years and years and years.
Sure.
But you would at least think that there would be some level of balancing and healing as it relates to okay, I'm fine, like I'm not burying this secret any longer. But that's not what the statistics.
The statistics certainly shouldn't line up where
Yeah.
as things get quote unquote better, right? It's more affirming that suicide rates get worse.
Yeah.
Like at the very least, it should stabilize or ideally it should go down, right? Because that's the argument, is that there's so many people struggling, and now they're allowed to come out and be who they are, which is ultimately what's going to make them happy. So what it would indicate is that is not happening, and of course when you align that with the change in the type of gender dysphoria we're seeing. Obviously, the increased suicide rate could point to some other things, like maybe people are looking for something that they think will give them happiness, and they're finding it doesn't.
Right.
But we'll get into that in a little bit. So suicide rates are going up, and you asked the question of why, right?
Yeah.
So here's some of the interesting research that I did, and Abigail Schreier and some others talk about this in their book too, as well. Is there's things she calls them peer contagions or social contagions, and maybe you've heard that term before. And contagion, it's not meant to be overly negative of people that are a part of this, but it's the idea of like a contagion spreads.
A causality.
That spreads through a group of people quickly.
Yeah.
And so there in psychology, there's this really clear understanding of the idea of a peer or social contagion that can absolutely happen. And we know historically there's these examples, especially when it comes to medical issues. So what they found it's interesting, is like when a new diagnosis or potential diagnosis emerges on the medical scene, what they found is a lot of, and in particular women, even more so than men, will self-diagnose and self-connect to that new diagnosis in the hopes that will be the solution they've been looking for. So, for example, in 1994 in Hong Kong, there had been no kind of reports of eating disorders, or very little, very minimal. And then there was a report given from, I think, one of the American journals or New York Times or something about eating disorders and anorexia. And immediately they saw this massive spike in Hong Kong of women self-identifying as having eating disorders.
Sure.
And so psychologists would basically say that what ends up happening is if you're struggling with some mental health issues, well, what are you ultimately looking for? You're looking for help, right?
Yeah.
You're looking for a solution.
Answers, something.
Answer something that will help you with what you're dealing with. So when a potential diagnosis comes about, it can feel like a lifeline, right?
Sure.
It could feel very hopeful.
This explains something, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Maybe this is my issue.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden you'll see in droves people latching onto it.
Yep.
Now imagine if that diagnosis is also celebrated culturally, which is what we're seeing.
Yeah.
It certainly explains or could explain this kind of massive migration in a culture of young people who are dramatically dealing with mental health issues like never before.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things that they lay out as.
And that gets to some of the things, some of the conversation we had as it related to identity, right? Wanting to fit in, wanting to be a part of a group. And if you have felt for a significant period of your life that you're by yourself, you're isolated, now all of a sudden here's a group that I can be a part of, that I can identify with, that I can, that has this shared experience. And it feeds that part of our heart that is broken, that only Christ is supposed to give us our identity in, but we'll give our identity away to anything for the sake of trying to fill that void, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And just some other statistics to show you kind of the trajectory of this issue is, we went from 0.01 to 2% identifying as transgender. So in 1.1 million high school students, that's a total of 1.1 million high school students across the country. Most of those are girls who are identifying. We've gone from 1 in 10,000 to 2 out of 100 identifying as transgender. In 2007, there was just one gender clinic in the United States. Now there's well over 50, and that number is growing, very quickly. And so, all that to show you is the trajectory of where we've gone, that this has now become, I wouldn't even say an accepted, I would say it's become culturally kind of a celebrated thing amongst young people. And there are conversations. My wife's a substitute teacher, and she'll talk to me about conversations that happen in high schools, and where it's almost like it's now become almost it used to be being gay and lesbian was kind of the rebellious thing to be. Well, now that's not even anything. It's like, what is that? So now gender has become kind of the new version, I think, of sexuality, and it's not even it's even transitioned from transgender, like, oh, I'm a boy but I feel like I should be a girl, to now it's gender fluid, it's non-binary, I'm nothing, I'm whatever, you know what I mean? So it's really kind of morphed into something that I don't think any of us really envisioned. And it's certainly, all that to say is, it has turned into something that is in no way resembles classic gender dysphoria that we've known for a long time.
Jared, why do you think gender and sexuality, why do you think those are the primary things right now that related to that identity piece that seems to be under attack in just an unbelievably different way? Because there's lots of different things that could be, but right now in our current culture, in our current society, sexuality, gender, all that kind of stuff, and to some degree they're all related. Yes, I understand there's difference as it relates to attraction versus how you feel, those sorts of things. Do you have any thoughts or maybe anything that you've studied, that why gender, why sexuality, why do you think that's under attack in the way that it is right now in the culture?
Well, we talked about on our last podcast, identity is always a part of every, it's a part of everything, right? It's ultimately the whole gospel narrative, a Christian narrative, is that it's only when we find our identity in Christ that we were made whole.
Yeah.
So everyone who hasn't found their identity in Christ is looking for identity in something, right? So that's not a new feature.
Yeah.
However, the gender thing is somewhat new, certainly in recent times, and I think there's some reasons for it. One of them is our kind of movement away from objective truth. So if you think about it, it's like what historically has been kind of the most objectively true thing? Well, gender, male and female, is one of those things. I mean, it's literally what you need for reproduction. It's at a scientific level, there's nothing more kind of objectively true than your chromosomes or, so once you start to knock down the idea that there is a such thing as objective truth, and of course that's kind of the foundation for the argument of God.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, and not to over spiritualize something, but it is, I think maybe you were about to get into it, so I apologize if I'm overlapping you here, but it is it is a way to attack God as creator, right?
Absolutely.
Like even in our science right now, as it relates to origin theories and things like that, the overwhelming move in the scientific community is there needs to be some explanation for a creator because everything is pointing in that direction.
Right.
So like now all of a sudden, not only is this attack on God's creation, but it's an attack on God the creator who created
Yep.
them man and woman and who established this idea of how he's going to use sex for his his glory and his purpose and the union of marriage. It's as
Right.
much as it is an attack on his creation, us as humanity, it's a in God's face attack of him as creator as well, right?
Yeah, and I think culturally with young people, like, so much of our foundational kind of beliefs are Judeo-Christian beliefs, even if you're not a Christian.
Right.
So there's now an attack on any of those things, like anything that historically had relevance or had meaning within our culture. So male and female,
Yeah.
marriage, all of these things are directly under attack. It was like culturally there was this vitriol for those things, and instead of previously there'd always been a appreciation and respect for where we came from.
Sure. And even purity in general, right? Which is
Any sexual ethic, really.
absolutely. Yeah.
So I think that's why I think that's a big part of it. It's
Yeah.
like it's almost this mentality of like we got to burn all this to the ground
Sure.
and make our own way.
Yeah.
And so, but I also think a big contributor to why we've seen the increase and where we've come is you got to remember, like, this generation is also a generation that is coupled with technology in a way that no other generation has. Like even ours, we grew up without cell phones in high school.
Yeah.
Right? Like you and I think I got mine very into high school, maybe college.
Sure.
So yeah, we've got a connection to technology, but it's not the same
Sure. Absolutely.
as preteens and teenagers right now who grew up surrounded by it. So they're growing up. If you go on, if you look at the influencer culture and you look on YouTube, and what you're going to find is transgender young men or young women who are trying to transition and they have become very popular. So they're on screen, they're seeing people walk through this. And if you watch some of the biggest kind of people in that space,
Social
influencers in that
yeah.
space, I mean, they'll talk about their journey, some of them getting surgeries, young women who are trying to transition to men, putting things around to suppress their breasts. And there's this very much what it ends up being is this idea of acceptance and community.
Yeah.
So along with this movement, where it used to be kind of individualistic, right? Like I struggled, nobody knew about it. What it's become is this kind of public community where we're all in this together. And what's wild is that a lot of these influencers, I mean, there's stuff where they're saying like, hey, if your parents don't agree with you, like I'll send you, they're called binders, I'll send you this, I'll mail it to your friend's house, tell me. So there's this also this providing of this kind of community environment at the sake of casting off family members, parental units.
Which is a huge, I mean, that in and of itself, in fact, it might even be worth us exploring a whole conversation related to the disintegration of the family unit.
Absolutely.
And how that also is an attack on the gospel and what God's plan is for flourishing and all those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Jared, are you aware of, in anything that you've read or in any of your studying, especially as you had mentioning our access to technology, has there been any specific study that you're aware of related to exposure to pornography and earlier ages as it relates to any of the gender dysphoria? Obviously, it unlocks sexuality in the brains of young people earlier and earlier in the exposure that they have. Are you aware if there's any connections there?
I'm not aware of any connection. I think that's a very interesting idea, though, and
you could certainly see how they could influence one another. Right?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. It's. I mean, we do know, and I think we referenced this in our last podcast. We do know we 100% know pornography has a negative effect on the brain and what it does, and the addictive behaviors that it creates, and what it can create dysfunctionally. So, but yeah, I've not heard any studies on that and transgenderism, but that's an interesting kind of thought. So, one of the other big, I want to kind of reference this. Like one of the other big, to answer the question, how has this happened? So one of the other massive changes that has happened, and I mentioned Dr. Kenneth Zucker, who was like the godfather of transgender, I would say, advocacy and help in therapy. He's basically been blacklisted
I was going to
by
ask
the
that
community.
question. I assumed that would probably be the case.
So to answer the question, why has this happened? Well, one of the other things is we've seen a massive shift in therapy practices, and this is from a kind of a state level, federal level down, where like right now 19 states have a ban on what they call conversion therapy. But
Yeah.
really what conversion therapy is it's saying it's the opposite of gender affirming therapy. So what these states are saying is basically they're forcing doctors and therapists to say you have to affirm whatever the gender is that of the student who comes in and says I'm this. And if you don't, if you're not supportive and affirming, we will pull your license.
Right.
Now, take a moment and think, and what they call that is conversion therapy, which is kind of a hit on the church and, pray the gay away and all that kind of stuff. But think about that for a moment. So what they're saying to a doctor is, you don't have the ability to diagnose a student. What we have to do is allow people to self-diagnose, and we have to affirm their self-diagnosis. Yeah. And if you don't affirm their own self-diagnosis, then you can lose your license.
Yeah, which is wild, because there are so many other cases in which nobody in their right mind would agree to that. So like every eating disorder,
absolutely.
Right? So a young girl who looks herself in the mirror and says to herself, I'm disgusting. I'm huge.
I'm
and
so fat.
Yeah. And she's 67 pounds.
Yep.
If she were to go into her teacher at her school or the counselor and say, they're not going to come along her and say, you're right, sweetie. You really need to do something about your weight. We can help you.
Yeah. Let me help you get diet pills. Let me help you.
Yeah. So like now we're just going to some degree, we're just kind of picking and choosing what things are appropriate and what things are not to support and to.
And so you're also handcuffing professionals, psychologists and therapists who know that a lot of times these issues are nuanced issues and they're layered and they're not even really about gender and sexuality. They're about all kinds of other things. But what you're doing is saying, no, you don't have the ability to even entertain the idea that, hey, maybe this is not your real issue.
Yeah.
Or maybe you're not a boy in a girl's body or a girl in a boy's body. Let's investigate some other things. So that has led to a massive increase, because think about it. If you're a parent and your teenager's struggling and they're having issues and you bring them in and maybe they've watched influencers on TV and they're like, oh, maybe that's my issue or whatever. And they go in and now the therapist isn't even allowed to say, well, maybe that's not your problem. In fact, they have to say, okay, let me support you. And let me support you by helping you move towards transitioning. So this is why this is such a big issue is it's not just a, hey, we rally for you and we cheer for you and that's great.
Yeah.
Now we are encouraging physical transition.
Sure. And this is why any circumstance like this in which the parents can be excluded, I would be uber leery of.
Right.
Any situation in which now the parent doesn't have any parental authority over their child and helping them. And so all of this stuff can be done totally in secret, whether it's through your school system, whether it's through the medical system. Like the parents don't have to be informed in and about any of this stuff. Anytime there's an issue in which the parent can be severed from the relationship is something I would be super suspicious of.
No, in places like, and in fact, this is a while ago that I did some of this research, so this could even already be the case. But in places like California, they were trying to pass a law that basically said that gender transition medication and things like that would actually be provided at the school, or that students would be allowed to leave school without notifying parents to go pursue transition medical care. Yeah. So whether it was surgeries, whether it was getting medication for transitioning. So think about that. You've got a teenager who's struggling. You as the parent aren't aware of the reality, and the school behind your back is encouraging that student to go and transition into another gender and not telling you. So they're encouraging a student to lie to you, to not tell you, because you're viewed as the enemy. And that is happening more and more in our school system. So again, to answer the question, how is this progressing? Well, there's another reason why it's progressing.
Sure.
And so to your point about the kind of the craziness of this, a generation of, and anyone who does youth ministry and works with students, we know this, right? We love them, we care for them, but they're idiots in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
We were idiots when we were
Yeah.
teenagers. That's why we don't let them, buy alcohol till they're 21. We don't
Yeah.
let them vote till they're 18. They can't join the military. So there's all these limitations on what they can do. Why? Because we recognize they're not mature enough to make those decisions.
Yeah.
Yet when it comes to arguably a far bigger decision than whether or not to drink a beer,
Sure. Yeah.
we'll say, hey, at 12, 13, you can cut off your genitals, you can mutilate yourself, you can for young women, a lot of these drugs they're finding make it so they can never have a child again.
Yeah.
So imagine
Yep.
that's why it's so important and serious what's taking
Sure.
place.
And depending on when people are listening to this, and sadly there may be more and more cases of this in the future. I mean, we're seeing cases now too where students are committing suicide, and the parents and they find out from the schools that this is something that their kids have been dealing with at the school for such a long time. The school's been super supportive. Now all of a sudden the kid has killed himself, and the parents are like, how has nobody ever had this conversation?
What do you mean you've
with
been
us?
calling him by a different name or her by a different name and you never,
Yeah.
exactly. So, and now I should say, this is an important point. Like Dr. Kenneth Zucker, he did believe in certain cases in the ability for people to transition, grown adults.
Yeah.
So I mentioned his 88% success rate. He was this. So this was not a.
He wasn't like I'm just going to kind of squash this in every case. That
Exactly.
I see.
He actually supported grown adults after they've gone through that who still struggled, being able to do, I believe he even supported some potential gender reassignment surgeries in adults. So I'm not saying I agree or disagree with that or what you should believe. I'm just saying that's the point.
Sure.
Don't dismiss a guy as some sort of quack who
He wasn't out for a vendetta against those who were.
he just recognized that growing up as a child and a teenager and a preteen.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of hormonal changes, all sorts of, how many thoughts did we have? How many things so to give them the ability to make dramatic decisions about their life and their physical body at that age is a huge mistake.
Yeah. So let's transition the conversation here as we bring some conclusion to some of these thoughts as it relates to, okay, how then now as loving adults in the lives of these teenagers, what are some solutions? What are some ways in which we can come alongside students and families? Let's talk through what do we do with this information? How do we apply this knowledge and exercise wisdom?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to give you a couple of thoughts I have. Some of them will be basic, and then I'm gonna at the end I'm gonna share three things that I think are important for us moving forward. Okay. So the number one predominant thought, and this is true of everything, is the gospel frees us. The gospel at the end of the day is the answer, and the reason it's the answer is because the gospel frees us from attaching our identity to anything other than Christ.
Yeah.
And so if you want to know what's the solution, it's like, oh, you're just Jesus juking us.
Yeah. Oh, thanks for dropping the Bible on that,
Right.
Jared.
But that is the solution. And we talked about it in our last episode. So if you haven't listened to that, go back, and we talked about how when you have conversations about sexuality, you have to have a conversation about identity.
Yep.
So how do we help it's ultimately helping them see that finding identity in gender is not going to make them happy.
Right.
Finding identity in money, power, success, sexuality, none of those, it will not satisfy them.
Yeah.
The only solution is to find identity in an identity that you can't earn, but an identity that's given to you.
Yeah.
And ultimately that's in Christ.
Good.
So I think that's the biggest thing that we have to keep in mind. The second thing I would encourage people to do is normalizing that there is, in fact, a spectrum of interests, not a spectrum of genders. And there's a difference.
Yeah.
So what I mean is you're going to have boys who are typically operate more feminine than the average boy. There is a spectrum of interests in each gender.
Sure.
There are women who tend to have masculine traits. There are men who tend to have more feminine traits. And I do think we need to normalize that, because one of the things that's happened is imagine if you're a young boy who tends to have more feminine traits, and what you're told is that's not normal.
You like girls' things. So
Yeah.
You must, yeah.
Right. So you start to think, maybe I'm in the wrong body,
Yeah.
right? And vice versa. You're a young girl who tends to, maybe you're more athletic, or not even athletic, but maybe you're more of a tomboy, as they used to say, or whatever. And you start to think, oh gosh, maybe there is something wrong with me.
Yeah.
So I do think we need to start normalizing the idea that there is a spectrum of interests within each gender.
Sure.
However, not affirming that there's a spectrum of genders and you can just be whatever you want. It's
Yeah.
like, no, we're all different,
Right.
even though you're a boy or a girl. So that's the second thing.
Yep.
I think the other thing I would encourage people to do is be cautious in knowing that there is a difference between someone who has a legitimate diagnosed gender dysphoria, because in all this conversation we have to understand that still is a real thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? We're not denying that. That
Right.
historically has been an accurate reality, and I think there are still people that legitimately have gender dysphoria. And so our job is not to diagnose that, but the whole point of this podcast is to help be aware of the reality that there are some who genuinely have gender dysphoria,
Yep.
and there are some who probably don't.
Yeah.
And what they're experiencing right now is not classical gender dysphoria, but
either
it's
a confusion or a need to be a part of something
sure
bigger than
so when you're
themselves.
facing students, and I'm not suggesting in any way that you would say this to
Call them out on it one way or
right.
another.
This
Yeah.
is for our own internal, even
Yeah.
as a parent, right?
Yeah.
If you're raising kids who is saying some of these things, it's helpful to go, okay, probably statistically, if they've presented no gender dysphoria their entire life and it's just now emerging now, this is probably not classical gender dysphoria. It's
Yeah.
probably something else,
Yeah.
right? And that's helpful to know how to help them.
Sure. Yeah. It's good.
So here are the three things that I lay out is number one, fight for truth.
Mm.
And I think what I mean by that is from a Christian perspective, we need not be afraid to stand up for biblical truth. And part of biblical truth you reference is the idea that, there is a difference between men and women.
Yeah.
And God has created us both in his image, and that's something to be celebrated. And I think we talked about this, like not being afraid to have the conversation.
Yeah.
And so we fight for truth with love, we fight for truth with grace, but we can't exit the conversation because we're scared. And I think the church has done that.
Yeah.
And we have to be able to talk about truth in our youth ministries. The other thing I would say is fight for awareness. So understanding, like we talked a little bit about what's happening on schools,
Yeah.
what's happening on social media.
Yeah.
Are we fighting for do we fight for awareness in those issues? Do we know what's happening in our schools? Do we
Yeah.
know what's happening on social media platforms? Do we know who the influencers are and what our students are hearing and the narratives being? A lot of times, the older we get, we're kind of out of the loop.
Sure. Yeah. And as responsible, youth leaders, adult leaders, these things, we have to be aware of these, of what the standards are in the area that you live, how it's influencing your schools. Because if you're going to be pacing with these students, it could affect policies and procedures that you have within your own ministry,
Absolutely.
and those sorts of things. So it's just important to stay on top of, and it is a rapidly evolving
Oh my gosh, yeah.
situation. So
Yeah, it's not easy, but I do think it's important.
yeah.
And then thirdly is we got to fight for families.
Yeah.
And we you referenced it a lot. We talked
Yeah.
about a lot about the challenge of parenting in this culture because of the disconnection and kind of the devaluing of the family. So we have to fight. So what I mean by that is your youth ministry more than ever before has to be a ministry that targets partnering with parents.
Yeah.
100%. I don't think it's ever been more important in youth ministry than it is right now. If you're not intentional about partnering with your parents, intentional about fighting for them, advocating that they would have the knowledge, that they would know what's happening.
Yeah.
Like I would encourage you, read this book and you yourself have a talk with your parents about, hey, here's
Yeah.
what we're seeing happening. Like, fight for families.
And obviously, it's important to recognize that there are adults who are affirming of these things. And so the
Absolutely.
assumption can't be that, they're a Christian family, so they agree with me in all of these areas. And it can be tricky sometimes to pace with families and parents. In fact, the number of times I've paced with parents, unsaved parents of kids who have gotten saved in our youth ministry, and the parents are either allowing or directing differently than what
Right.
we would. At the end of the day, I don't step in between a student and their parents because I'm saved and they're not, and you don't have to listen to your parents because they're not saved. Like, there are still healthy boundaries that we as adult leaders can have and guide and direct students to still submit to the authority of their parents, honor them, even if they don't have the same faith and understandings. And there's ways in which we can go with them and have these conversations and help educate and train with parents. But at the end of the day, every parent that didn't yet have a relationship with Christ and I was pacing with their students none of them ever pushed me away
Yeah.
because of me trying to usurp their authority as a
Right.
Christian adult in the life of the kid. They always were thankful that we were in the lives of their students because
Yeah.
we honored them, we were patient with them, we provided as many resources as we could to help them.
Right.
Every parent wants to be a good parent. Not every parent knows how to be, and,
Yeah.
and there are still lots of things I'm learning. I'm not suggesting I got there. But there are ways in which we can come alongside families, help them, love them, even if they don't yet have the same faith understanding
Absolutely.
that we do.
And that's one thing, like Abigail Schreiner book lays out, story after story after story of, and again, these are not Christians, but parents who started off and they really love their kids and they want the best for their kids.
Yeah.
And so the narrative they're hearing is the best way you help your kids is by affirming this.
Yeah.
But what they found is the more that they affirmed it, the worse things got. And the more they got disconnected with their kid and the more they're depressed their kid got. So that was really the why she wrote this book, is she was hearing story after story. So in youth ministry, this is not us saying your kids are bad because they say they're transgender and that's bad. This is helping us understand what is happening right now, so that we can help our students because we love them and we care for them. And I would encourage you to think about this as a mental health issue that we all struggle with mental health issues. So how do we ultimately help? The way to help is to understand what's taking place and partnering with parents and families. I think a lot of them, whether they're Christian or not, would be encouraged by this because in some ways it's very hopeful. It's like, oh, okay, so that's what's happening. Okay.
Yeah.
And it helps them make other decisions. Like, do I let them cut off their breasts as a young girl? Is that going to make them happy? Or and they can read some of these other stories and go like, maybe that's not the solution. So again, long story short, fight for truth, fight for awareness, and fight for families. I think that's a winning combination.
That's good. So, in conclusion here, we're recommending continue to get information as much as you can. Maybe even consider trying to connect with paraprofessionals in your community.
Absolutely.
Connect with those in the school systems. Understand what's happening in your school systems as a outflow of how you're going to serve your community. Fight for families in general, and just love the heck out of broken people, of which you are also a part of that community, right?
2 books I would recommend if you want to do a deep dive into this. The one I've referenced is Irreversible Damage by Abigail Schreiner. And then the other book I would recommend that's not really completely about this, but it's about the culture of this generation, is The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt. It's really good. They're a good combination to understand kind of why we are the way we are and why young people are acting the way they do. So I would encourage both of them. You can also look them up if you're more of a podcast person. Obviously, reading the book will be the deepest dive. But.
Awesome. Hey, thanks, Jared, so much for helping to guide and direct this conversation. We hope that this is super helpful to those that are listening or those that are watching. We hope that it inspires more conversations that you have, and we hope that ultimately it's useful. Find some time to get together with your team, with your leaders, have these conversations, talk through it, and the best way to actively come alongside students is to not shy away from the conversation, but to lean into it, press into it, and point people to someone who can restore all things.
That's it.
That's awesome.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you on the next one.